And you grew up here in Louisville? Or
For the
where were
most
you?
part, except I was in Louisville until I was about 11, 12, 13, whatever you are when you're in the 8th grade. And we had moved from Louisville to Pewee Valley in my 8th grade. And then about 3 years later was when I ended up in the seminary in Louisville for 3 years, and then in Baltimore for the next 6 years.
Did you go to Southern Baptist or Presbyterian?
No, at the time there was a seminary here called St. Thomas, which has been closed. It was a Catholic seminary, which in those days, some people entered from the 8th grade into high school. So it had 4 years of high school and 2 years of college, and at the end of that 6-year period, if you were there the whole time, or if you were there even just for college, then you were sent to what they call a major seminary, which would be somewhere like St. Meinrad. And my 6 years of major seminary were spent in Baltimore at St. Mary's University, and Seminary and University.
So when you were growing up with these parents who had this sense of justice and stuff, the places like Louisville had a lot of injustice. Did you feel like, did you all stick out at all as being a little bit different, not in the groove of?
I think Bob and Dolores may have, because they were more active in the community. My father and mother weren't that active in community affairs, so they weren't, I don't think people would even know them if I mentioned their names to them, but that definitely people would know Bob and Dolores because of their activities in the community. They were, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they were active in some kind of Young Democrats organizations and things of that sort, and Bob certainly took on some interesting causes early on in his career. I guess he decided to be a poor attorney because it was all pro bono as far as I can determine. So, but he did some great things. So, you know.
So it is in your DNA.
Yeah.
Let's just say that.
Where some of it started, it didn't start here, but where it came out for me for the first time in a strong sense was in Baltimore. I think this would have been 3rd or 4th year, junior or senior year of college.
And what year would that have been?
That would have been 64 and 65. And this building is no longer in existence, but that part of the seminary was in downtown Baltimore in the inner city, which was plagued by all the problems that inner cities were throughout the country. And a priest came over one day and asked those who came to a meeting if any of us wanted to help him establish a halfway house for ex-offenders, that he was finding resistance in the neighborhood and he needed some volunteers to go out and do some education of the community and get people to sign a petition that it was okay with them to have this halfway house. And that's where you got a sense for the not in my backyard, the resistance to that. And it was quite a thrill that we ended up actually winning the zoning case for that house. And so that was the very earliest actions that I was ever engaged in where I sensed that unfairness and unwillingness on the part of some. I mean, the reality is most of the neighbors were fine with it, but it's always those few who tend to be more vocal and get people's attentions, and so you have to go out and do this other kind of work and bring the real people out who don't have the objection, and it turned out real well. Sometimes it doesn't, but that time it did, so that was a nice taste of victory.
So you gelled in Baltimore in this?
Yeah, and then I worked in Baltimore. You did volunteer things when you were in school, and so one of the things we did was visit the Baltimore County Jail, which was located out on the fringe of Baltimore, Towson, which is like a suburb.
Towson, yeah.
And that was a fascinating experience because in those days the Vietnam War was going on. At one point, both the Berrigan brothers were jailed there, and
Philip and Daniel.
Philip and Daniel were both in jail along with 3 or 4 other people, and some people we'd been visiting, like this one woman I'll never forget. she was a heroin addict, and she couldn't understand why they were happy to be in jail and that kind of thing, And I tried to explain to her, well, they had a purpose for being here, and
Talk a little about the Berrigan brothers. Everybody may not be familiar with.
Oh well,
with them.
the Berrigan brothers. Daniel Berrigan was a recently deceased, actually, was a Jesuit priest, and Philip Berrigan was an order priest, and I'm not going to remember the order. Philip was a pastor at an inner city parish in Baltimore, and I don't know what Dan's official assignment was. I don't think he was at Fordham at the time, but he was an activist, anti-war activist during that period. And what they and several others, called the Catonsville Nine, had gone and burned draft records at the draft office, and I think burned their own draft cards or something, splattered the records with blood or something like that, some very public demonstration for which they were jailed, and I think ultimately may have spent a little bit of time in jail for those actions. After, they were there waiting for trial. But it was quite fascinating to meet them. We were kids, we're just like 19, 20, 21-year-old kids who have, never done that kind of stuff. But they were really good, and they had an effect on people, like people like me and others, that there is some value in standing up for rights and justice and peace,
cards,
and sometimes you're not going to be liked for doing that.
Exactly.
It was very fascinating. The warden of that jail was quite interesting too. He really cared about the people staying there, some of whom were not guilty because they hadn't been tried yet, and they may not have been guilty. They were just being held until they could get some adjudication. But he was Catholic himself, and he'd one of the best, the really finest liturgy that I ever spent on a Holy Thursday was in that jail with him, his family, inmates, and some guys from the seminary. It was just a real celebration, and very, very powerful. And the warden he tried to do the right thing for people and brought in programs that others had never done that. So that was also a taste of this kind of work. And during the summers about that time, and I think it was in 67, 68, I was working in the summer at the prison in LaGrange, which was not like it is now. It wasn't locked down, didn't have the razor wire and all that. It was a medium security Kentucky prison, and our job was, they were trying to concentrate on helping first offenders and keeping them separated in a dorm, separated from the rest of
The hardened.
more experienced inmates, and you could see. I saw things there that were completely unjust. There was a kid, never forget his name, Tuccinardi. He was, he was in jail for something, I don't know what. But one day he just wasn't there any longer, and he had been shipped to Eddyville on the word of a lying corrections officer. I made a note in the record on that. I got called into the assistant warden's office, and he said, we're going to take that note out. We don't record things like this. And of course, at the time, I'm not who I am now. I said, okay, we'll take the note out. If I was who I am now, I'd say, well, we can either take the note out, or you have a choice. I'll call somebody else. I'll call a newspaper, I'll call a TV station, and I'll find out why this kid was unjustly sent to Eddyville and why that lying officer gets to do this. So those are the kind of things that occur that let you know that as good a system as we have, it's not a perfect system. And there are people that get kind of ground up in it unfairly.
We see it all the time.
And it's horrible.